big ball. Going for the big shot, and he hits it.
That's batted into the air, intercepted, and the Bears are going to win it.
The scouting combine's officially here. We finally got to hear from Ryan Poles and Ben Johnson for the first time since the Bears formally introduced Ben Johnson as head coach. Welcome into the Halas Beat, brought to you by the Bear Report. I'm Usayd Koshul. He's Nick Whalen. You can check us out on Twitter at Halas Beat, at Usayd Koshul, at _Nick Whalen. Nick, I don't know about you, but there was a tale of basically two contrasts with those press conferences today, right? Because if you listen to them, I mean, Ben Johnson said a whole lot of stuff that we're not used to covering this team, especially coming from the head coach. Ryan Poles kind of did the exact same thing, and it was at a point where I'm just like, look, dude, give us something more than like, hey, our system, our process, or this, or that, the whole spiel and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, 100%, man. It's honestly like this is Ben Johnson's first head job, right? So he's excited and he's having fun, and there's even more than just the main interview that we'll talk about here in a bit, but that he's pretty loose and his personality is having fun, which I feel like was Ryan Poles to start with. Like I loved every Ryan Poles presser, like his second year, because he was processed and he was open and he was honest. I'm like, dude, this guy's got it. And now he's like a World War veteran. You know what I mean? Like he's been in the trenches. He's taken some fire, you know what I mean? And he's like, I'm not saying anything. I'm going to keep everything close to the vest. Like I don't even like the media anymore. Like it was very, very odd.
I mean, it definitely was weird. And to me, a lot of, just starting off with the Poles presser here, a lot of what he said, it wasn't necessarily surprising. But if you start to do what we have to do when it comes to covering this team, which is read between the lines, the reality of it to me is almost just the fact that he pretty much came out and mentioned that the left tackle position was going to have some competition. Mm-hmm. And then someone asked him about Trey Smith, and it was like, well, I'm not getting into players that are not on our roster right now. And then it was just a whole lot of like, hey, we're going to kind of go ahead and figure this thing out. But starting off with the left tackle comment, I mean, that to me is basically, we're going to leave the door open to try and figure this thing out. And it throws the number 10 overall pick into a complete whirlwind. Because if you're the Bears, and again, we've been doing this show about a month and a half, 2 months now, you and I have gone back and forth on this, right? Like, you and I have kind of said, maybe it is time to significantly upgrade from Braxton Jones. And to me, the Bears are finally recognizing that as well, because they're basically saying, well, whatever happens, we are going to beef up that left tackle spot, because it's not just going to be Braxton Jones and Akram Amagashi. We may bring in a third guy as well to really make some of these guys have to work.
Yeah, and so I think if we look into this from multiple angles, it means a lot of things. It can mean that Braxton Jones' recovery isn't going as well as we thought. And so that way, that free agency or draft means that they have to bring in more competition because they're not sure if he'll, one, be healthy for the whole season or if he'll be ready for the start of the season, which, we know how that worked with Karan last year. Or it means that they don't like his long-term potential as the left tackle, and that either they're going to bring in other competition or Karan is going to get a shot to start there. But it means something. It's because in the world of his press conference today of nothing, he said something about left tackle. So either way, it's not great news for Braxton Jones. The other thing that he said that was kind of interesting, where he had the opportunity to, we like our guys type comment. He did not really support DeAndre Swift at running back, which I thought was kind of interesting too. So, instead of like, well, we like our running backs, our development or whatever, he was very vague. He didn't like support it. So, if we have to like read between all the lines, I thought that could be something. Is that what you thought too?
It is. Okay, so to me, that was an incredibly polarizing conversation because he kind of took like two ends of the spectrum here with this thing, right? Like, he's acknowledged, like, he didn't directly say this, but he kind of acknowledged that when the Bears signed DeAndre Swift last year, that was pretty much the Bears signing a running back that fits Shane Waldron's offense. Well, now you go ahead and a year later, you basically bring in a completely new staff and a new coaching staff and everything that requires a completely different set of personnel. Now, which means you're going to have a completely different set of players. But then he also kind of talked about the fact that guys like a Gerald Everett or DeMarcus Walker, the reason the Bears moved on from them was not just to save money, it was because of scheme fit. And so to me, DeAndre Swift seems to be headed down this very similar path here. And I know some of the people that are listening to this are probably thinking that, well, Ben Johnson said that DeAndre Swift, I've already got a relationship with him. He's a great player, very explosive. He does what we want to do at the running back position. But at the end of the day, the question is this, right? Are the Bears going to try and run the offense that Ben Johnson wants, like the 101 offense, or like the 300, 400 level offense? And to me, at some point along the road, if you're going to get to that 300, 400 level offense of what Ben Johnson wants to do, that's going to require moving on from guys like DeAndre Swift. But then at the end of the day, you look at what Ryan Poles is saying, and it sounds like, the Bears are willing to kind of ride things out this year and then go into next offseason with a resolution in place.
Yeah, I mean, they also could have mentioned Roshan, you know what I mean, if they had confidence there, but that also wasn't, mentioned. So to me, it says someone's going to get brought in the draft. Now, again, a deep running back class, and I'm fine with that, right? That's great that you can just, hey, you can dive in deep there. So between the press conferences, okay, I'm going to take a break. So we kind of covered Ryan Poles. The other thing that got rumored today pretty heavily, and that's the other thing that we're going to get, y'all. We're going to just get things now that's football season, rumors and things kind of going about. The rumor out of Kansas City is Trey Smith is likely going to re-sign there. There was some talk from Brett Veach, their GM. There's also some stuff floating around the media outlets. So he might not be on the market. So I know a lot of Bears fans have really honed in on him. I have not as much because I always thought this was an option, especially with the salary cap expanding. They might have to alter course with fixing the interior O-line in free agency.
Okay, full disclosure to our listeners and reviewers on YouTube, I have been up since about 4:35 in the morning Central Time. We are recording this thing about 8:50, so I've been up for about 14 to 15 hours now, which is, trust me when I say this, not an easy thing, And based on
but you're a gamer, man. You're a gamer, yeah. Right? I mean, this is what pros do.
Exactly. Yes, that is the point. Never ever can miss a episode. Okay, but listen. So getting back to the rumors, this to me is possibly the worst case scenario for the Bears right now, because regardless of what you want to say on Twitter, and let's just acknowledge this, the problem with Twitter is that there's a whole bunch of like fan-driven narratives out there creating unrealistic expectations before something actually happens, right? Like it was always in the back of my mind of, okay, well, maybe Trey Smith doesn't end up re-signing. And then what happens is this, then we get into the possibility of Drew Dalman, right? But what if the Bears land Drew Dalman and Trey Smith, right? But there's just so many moving pieces that you almost have to wonder, well, what's plan B, C, and D? And the answer is it's like, well, if Trey Smith re-signs in Kansas City, because Kansas City being Kansas City, Trey Smith, to me, on the O-line was the least of their problems. I understand everyone wants to say he's getting worked in the Super Bowl by Jalen Carter, but like that just wasn't Trey Smith getting worked the whole time. That was the entire O-line with Creed Humphrey, with Joe Thuney, with Jawan Taylor. They spent a high pick on Humphrey. They paid Thuney in free agency. They didn't have a very good left guard all year anyway, so they had to put a rookie left tackle out there. Jawan Taylor, let's just call it how it is. I mean, I think Bears fans should consider themselves lucky that the Bears missed out on Jawan Taylor a couple of years ago. And so this is a situation where it's like, let's just say Dalman goes back to Atlanta. Let's just say Trey Smith stays in Kansas City. Now, if you're the Bears, well, what do you start to do? Well, the market thins out to the point where now you're looking at a couple of veterans on a 1-2 year deal, and that's pretty much about it.
Well, it reminds me a lot of, I think this was 2 years ago, maybe 3, where Bears fans were convinced that we're going to get Elgin Jenkins, right, from Green Bay. And, he's the top one out there. We got a bunch of money. And then what happens right before free agency starts? he gets signed to get or re-signed by Green Bay. So that was one huge rumor. The other one I think is of note because the Bears are looking at pass rush. This is something I had heard previously, but now that it's kind of more out, is Mike Green, who I love his tape, by the way. I'm a huge Mike Green fan in terms of his film. But he got dismissed from Virginia and then ended up in Marshall, is that there is some background concerns. I'll keep that loose. Multiple time background concerns. So I don't know if that's going to make him fall in the draft. If those things are, all true or not, but it's some rumors, and that's what happens this time of year. Stuff like that comes around. And I wouldn't mention that. I don't think if I heard it from multiple spots, because you'll hear a lot of stuff this time of year, but that one seems like it might have some legs.
Yeah, and what's interesting about that one is doing my own research on it as well. I mean, it's not even going back to Virginia. It's dating even farther back to his days in high school. So you're looking like, 5-6 years down the road. And so that one is going to be very significant. But again, like, if I'm the Bears, the reality of it is, am I doing my research on as many pass rushers as I can? 125%. Am I going to go ahead and lose my mind because, Mike Green is our guy, but then doesn't end up being our guy and we've got character concerns about him? No, because there's plenty of other guys in this draft, like a Nick Scorton or even a Shamar Stewart, that I look at and I'm like, all right, I'm genuinely excited about those guys. Which, by the way, side note here, if you are not familiar with the name Nick Scorton, you might as well start to get familiar with him, because to me, like, if the Bears trade out of 10, he's going to be the guy to target in that 15 to 20 range, because he is a Trey Hendrickson clone, which fits exactly what Dennis Allen wants to do. But, again, I'm just not super concerned about the Mike Green rumor. Not because, the Bears aren't going to, draft him or anything, but simply because it's there's plenty of other pass rushers out there.
Oh, yeah, there's plenty of them. I think I'm moving away from pass rush at 10 because I considered him and maybe James Pierce, and I just think now I'm pivoting to other positions. So going away from, just things that we've heard, let's get to Ben Johnson, man. So Ben Johnson had his press conference, in front of Bears media, but then also I've listened to him on the Waddle and Sylvie show with one of the news outlets in Chicago in terms of their local news with Chris Sims, Ben Johnson was making the rounds, and dude, Ben Johnson was fun, man. Here's one small just caveat of him just having fun because, I don't know if he's excited for the job or maybe this is his personality. We're all getting to know some of it. So he was talking about his staff, okay, and who he hired, and talked about Antoine Randall L. And so in terms of the meat and potatoes part of it, he said there were two people that he was shocked that he got on staff, and one was Randall L. And the other interviewer was like, oh, well, there's a lot of stuff about Randall. Do you know, his background, and because he's a Chicago guy, and he's like, I don't know if you know who drafted him. And she was like, the Cubs. And he's like, yeah, the Cubs. And he's like, I think it was round 14. So they're having this kind of fun back and forth. And she's like, well, did you know he beat Kevin Garnett in the Illinois State basketball playoffs? So it was a fun, not, scripted. I'm going to give the no, big points back and forth. And then the other fun thing, man, that I heard is they were talking about him going to Wrigley. So, he has talked about that. He was excited to be in Chicago because he's always been to Wrigley. And he said he went to the airport and no one recognized him. And so he thinks that he still could go in the bleachers potentially this season. I do not think that's the case, Ben Johnson. I think that people are going to recognize you. But I thought it was just kind of a fun back and forth where you're seeing his personality and he doesn't seem overwhelmed. He seems calculated and relaxed. A really smart guy, but just he's having fun with the media. And it's nice to see that before, because Flus got to be pretty just dry. And it's nice to see some fun from our head coach.
And I'm going to fully back you up there. What is so interesting about Antoine Randall, also just for some context, is that he actually went to Thornton Township High School, and I believe they won because Randall L was drafted in 2002, right? So this, I think, would have been a few years before, well, a couple years, after he was there. But like, they ended up winning a state championship, and the big thing to understand with Thornton Township is that it has always been, by all standards, a pretty solid and very respectable program, but and there's a ton of history and tradition in that area anyway, which I think is so cool to see him coming back home, because it's like, to me, when I look at the Bears staff over the last couple of years, like, let's be honest about something, right? Like, you need someone on staff, whether it's a position coach, whether it is a guy that has a connection to the Bears, just someone that's going to get the Bears excited about football. And like, Ben Johnson and Antoine Randall L are obviously doing that. To me, when you hear Ben speak, the big thing is that he seems so relaxed, like you mentioned. The guy's loose. The guy's like, look, I'm here. I'm having fun. I'm going to go ahead and do this. One of the big things that was very sort of telling to me was the fact that when he went ahead and he basically said, like, hey, listen, we are going to go ahead and we're going to get back to the fundamentals of each position. And then I'm also going to go ahead and use my analytics background. But the other big thing he said to me was the fact that, someone asked him, well, what influence would you have if you added someone like a Myles Garrett? He's like, look, we obviously want to go ahead and we want to rush the passer, but the big thing is we want to affect the passer. There's a lot of ways to upgrade. We want to upgrade the pass rush, and we want the pass rush to basically set the corners up and the linebackers up to make the secondary's life easier. So to me, I look at that and I'm like, okay, this guy's already got a vision, despite not being a defensive-minded guy. He's already got a vision for what he wants the defense to kind of go ahead and do at its most foundational level. And the amount of collaboration that's taking place is insane.
Well, leaning into that more, he talked about Dennis Allen multiple times. I've heard this. He talked about like some of his favorite parts of the day is just hanging out with DA, is how he calls him, Dennis Allen, the defensive coordinator, y'all, and just talks ball and whatever, and or being a head coach. Like, he's like, I'm leaning into his expertise and things that, he's bringing up, and where we're going back and forth in terms of, just, defensive positional guys, like things like that. But that's just something that he's enjoying, which I like too, because he's going to value his assistants and what they say. I mean, you don't want a dictatorship in terms of a head coach. You want a collaborator. And he sounds like he's collaborating with him. He talks about collaborating already in draft rooms with Poles and his staff. He's like, it's amazing to see them work and how efficient they are. He's like, it's area scout talks, then local scout talks, and then like they have a boom, boom, boom. And he's like, it's such a well-oiled machine that he's surprised. But you're getting tidbits into his day and how he's going around and talking to people. It's not just, Ben Johnson, this is the offense I'm going to put in. It's, hey, I'm going to talk to everyone, including this. I thought was a pretty cool little tidbit. He talked to Johnny Morton. So he's going to be the OC now with the Lions. And he said, hey, you worked with Declan Doyle. What's he like? And he said, he's Ben Johnson. He's like you. He's that type of guy. And it's just refreshing because Ben said in terms of his staff, he didn't want to have all of his buddies, which is what you see. You see guys like, hey, I know this guy. I worked with him before. We're going to bring him on. If it's not the best person, he's like, I wanted to bring in a diverse group, but also a group that can be fun and bring a bunch of different ideas too. So you could just see the wheels spinning where this isn't your normal guy. This guy, I think, is at an advanced level, not just as a play caller, but I think as a coach and a person and his vision for the Bears.
And on that note, let's just look at some of the hires the Bears made in terms of the offensive side of the ball. Some of the bigger name guys. So it's like, you got Ben Johnson there, obviously. He is cut from one specific cloth. The big thing to understand about Ben Johnson is he's not your typical, like, hot mind or hot name at the head coaching position where he's cut from, like, the Shanahan McVay tree, because, like, Matt LaFleur and Kevin O'Connell are from that same tree. So it's like, bring him in, fine. You got Ben Johnson. Declan Doyle, a guy that was heavily influenced by Sean Payton. So there is that, right? A completely different system that if you go back over the last, let's just say, 15-ish years, has traditionally always been a very respectable system that even though toward the end of the Sean Payton years with the Saints, they weren't incredibly explosive on offense. They didn't have the pass game that they used to. They were still a really good team when it came to running the football. And again, CC Alvin Kamara on that, right? Then you have Press Taylor, who kind of comes from that like Chip Kelly sort of background, as your passing game coordinator. And by the way, Press Taylor has been linked to Chip Kelly for forever because they were together when Chip was the head coach in Philly. Press was there as a young assistant at the time. And so you got Press Taylor there, completely different system of things. And then in the middle of all that, you've got guys like Al Harris and Dan Rouchar, the O-line coach over at who was the former O-line coach at Tulane, now with the Bears. So again, it just becomes this sort of thing where it's like, what is so interesting about the way that head coaches build out staffs is that at any level, trust me, whether it's high school, college, or the NFL level, if the head coach is going somewhere, he's bringing a handful of his guys with him. And yes, by the way, I will mention that is completely true at the high school level. And then what happens from there is that from there, you eventually plug in the pieces and add on a few guys here and there. But for the most part, like a lot of the major positions are solidified. And we didn't even mention JT Barrett getting the promotion from assistant quarterbacks coach to basically quarterback coach, which is another big thing because that's a guy who's basically worked with Ben Johnson, helped turn Jared Goff around, and now is going to be tasked with helping get Caleb Williams on track. And like he's seen, how to flip the script for a quarterback, basically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and he talked about Dan Rouchar getting hired. And he says during the interview process, he says we were like just on the same page with not only just the Bears line, but their vision for it. And he mentioned like he wants smart guys up front, and that way you can see the twists and the stunts and the blitzes and things going up there, which hasn't been the case in Chicago, y'all. The other thing I thought was interesting O-line wise from Ben Johnson is he mentioned that he sees Darnell Wright, and again, this is something that you've said, man, Darnell Wright as the Penei Sewell, where you utilize the guy and his best traits in a multitude of different ways, and so I thought that was pretty cool. And my radar went off. I'm like, oh man, Usayd's going to be pumped about that one. The other one, and you had mentioned this briefly, but just staying coaching staff wise. So he was surprised he got Antoine Randall from Dan Campbell because he's like, dude, Randall is so good. And he says he's the assistant head coach. And he says that means something to both of us. So, because sometimes there's just titles that go out there and you're like, what does this title mean? It's just to keep the guy there. But he says, I'm going to have stuff going on because it's a different role for me. I might have to do more media stuff, more this or that. And he trusts Declan Doyle to leave the offense to him. That's why he's there if he can't be there. And he trusts Randall L to run the team if he can't be there for certain things too. So, and he says he's ready for that. So it was cool in terms of just he understands why those guys are there, but then also was willing to delegate and have them do that. Because I think if you're not having your assistants thrive and get some autonomy, then those guys aren't going to stay and they're not going to grow as coaches.
Yeah, those are some really good points that you made there. The Declan Doyle hire to me was kind of polarizing in a sense at first because a lot of people were like, whoa, why'd you even do this? But I think it's going to be one that ends up working out for this team. But, you talk about just the overall makeup of what the Bears have to accomplish this week in Indy as we sort of look at it, right? Like these press conferences to me always sort of lay the foundation for what this team is ultimately going to do over the next 4 to 5 days. Now I start to look at this thing and I start to kind of look at what's next for the Bears, right? Like you're doing your homework on edge rushers. The next big thing is later this week. I think it's Saturday where the O-linemen are getting a lot of their measurements in. And so that arm length is going to be one to watch. Like If you have Will Campbell and Kelvin Banks locked in firmly at tackle, you may want to think about possibly changing that because of the measurements that are going to come in. If there's a player like a Armand Membo that's ranked lower on your board, specifically because you think he went to a smaller school, which again, Mizzou is a smaller school in the context of some of these SEC schools. The reality of it is that there is going to be a lot of movement up the board, and I wouldn't be surprised if there is a few surprise names that enter the conversation for 10 overall this year.
Dude, he looks good on film, by the way. Like, I could see him as a tackle, but also a guard. He looks good. There's some good linemen, y'all. Yeah, no, that's definitely something to pay attention to. A few other things I have. Again, I got notes for this, y'all. I have to always look over. So if we look at another staff thing, the other person he was shocked he got was Al Harris. He's like, that guy is awesome. He's like, I couldn't believe he was available because every time he's faced Dallas a secondary, they've given him problems and just how he's coached up guys there. So I thought that was of note. And then he talked about Caleb. Okay. One thing that I love is he told Caleb, he says, your success is my success. And that just means that like we're in this together. This isn't okay, you did this. This is your problem. Like we're linked at the hip, which I think is good. And I mean, it's true. It's a marriage, but they, just have how he phrased that, I thought was just a lot of trust that is going to go back and forth there. And he talked about Caleb's creativity, which is good, because that's something that he's good at. But he said it's elite, and his accuracy of throwing the run is elite. And that's not something that you hear in coach speak that often. I don't know that I've heard Ben Johnson say the word elite before. So again, speaks more to why he's here in Chicago and what he thinks of Caleb. But overall, I just thought Ben Johnson was honest, man. And it was refreshing to see him as a real person, to joke a little bit. He gave tidbits into actual players. He talked about, man, we got to help that D-line. At one point, he says they had some attrition. He says Andrew Billings was certainly a guy that I saw that I thought was really good when we faced him, and then they didn't have him in the last part of the year. That's honest. We all saw that, but he's just telling it to the media, and it's like, yep, that's true. And we got to help those guys over there, which means D-line's a point of emphasis, which we all know. So like he wasn't like hiding. He's like, well, we'll just see what happens and let the board fall where it falls and want to get values. He's literally pointing out, hey, we need help here, we need help there. And it was, I've said this before, but it was refreshing for me.
Yeah, I'll admit, it was a really good to kind of hear all the different things that he had to say. And again, just being pinpoint honest is something that I will be honest as well with you guys. Like, being someone that's been at Halas Hall for 3 head coaches now, right? And 2 general managers. Like, I was there for the Matt Nagy years. I was there for the Matt Eberflus years. Been there for the Ben Johnson years. The tough part is it's always been kind of the same stupid and like simple coach speaking lingo. And so it's phenomenal to kind of see things turning around and things basically being very different. Basically, because there's finally a head coach that's going to start telling us how it is. Now, obviously, right, like you don't win in the NFL because of your press conferences. You win because you win football games. So the hard part for the Bears still has to kind of be done. And to me, like all of that starts this weekend with the combine, because I believe that the Bears are going to come out this offseason. They're going to make a couple moves here that are genuinely going to surprise people. And with the way that the head coach is wired in terms of his focus on wanting to get back to the fundamentals, I would not be surprised to see him go ahead and to see him, end up turning this thing around quickly.
Well, yeah, he had said, I mean, I think to Caleb, I think it was where this comment was directed, but he said, yeah, my job is to win and to win now. It's not like this huge rebuild thing. And he had mentioned in one of the pressers I saw of, because we were talking about like the offensive line and rebuilding it. And he's like, well, Carolina did it last year, where they invested heavily at guard. So like, as you're saying, for like a big move, I think if the guy is there, they're going to throw some money out there and sign a guard. I mean, Ryan Poles said that if they're clean in terms of their eval, that they're going to put resources into it. And so it seemed like they have this like vision that's very aligned, and that I think they're going to be more aggressive this free agency than we've seen in past years.
Yeah, which will be really good to see, but I think that you also have to kind of be cautious there in terms of like the fact of, hey, spending big in free agency doesn't necessarily mean that you are going to go ahead and that every single hire is going to end up being a home run. Like you certainly have to me, temper your expectations with free agency because it's like, hey, 48 hours ago, or I'm sorry, our last episode, which was just 24 hours ago, we were talking about, well, what about the Bears signing Trey Smith? 24 hours later, everything gets flipped on its head, and now it's, well, maybe the Bears' free agency plans are in total limbo simply because of the fact that it may not make sense to sign Trey Smith because he's not going to be available. So then after that, it's like, well, who do you pivot to? And it's like, you're really going to go to the center that is undersized and not as athletic as people think to fit what Ben Johnson's trying to do. So again, it is all this sort of like chess match and guessing game for the Bears right now.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's what leads into the fun of it for all of us, right? Because then we get to put our mock drafts out there and our mock off seasons, etc. So I think, honestly, I think the Trey Smith news is a little refreshing because I feel like everyone has had the same vision, and that's not how this works. Things ebb and flow in terms of the draft and free agency. You don't know who's going to fall and who's going to be interested in your club. So I think being a little bit more loose with our expectations will be a little bit healthier in terms of the conversations over the next few months. But there's going to be change in Chicago, y'all. They're going to bring in guys that, as you alluded to earlier, weren't those gray area guys. They're going to be scheme fits, guys that Ben Johnson wants, that Dennis Allen wants. And I think Ryan Poles is going to be a lot more collaborative with them than it was with Flus.
Which, last comment I'm going to make before we get out of here, as a coach, I'm going to put the coach's hat on. Scheme fit in college and the NFL trumps anything and everything. Like, if you get the right player for your scheme, it is going to be off to the races. Forget the fancy contracts and the big names. Like, scheme fit is where it's at, okay? And I'm telling you guys right now, if all 32 head coaches and GMs in the league could solely sign players that fit their scheme, all right, nobody would be unhappy. Sometimes you got to take a player from a different scheme, fit him into your scheme, modify the scheme just a bit, but scheme fit trumps anything and everything. Before we get out of here, make sure that you like, comment, rate, and subscribe to the show on YouTube as well as wherever you get your podcasts, Apple Pods, Spotify, whatever it is. Make sure you're following us on Twitter at Usayd Koshul, _Nickel, and at Halas Beat. All right, we'll see what the rest of the week holds. We know we're getting these episodes out early this week, but maybe we do a third episode this week. I don't know. We shall see based on how things go. But other than that, bear down, enjoy the combine, have a great rest of your week.